I wasn't there when they first found him. I think it was an older woman who saw him while walking her dog. The man was standing in the river, reaching out into nothing, speaking in tongues. He was wearing a jumpsuit from the South Dakota Department of Corrections. The woman hurried back home and called the authorities. That got the ball rolling. The police brought him in. They fingerprinted him and checked the records, thinking he was some kind of escaped convict. Turns out that wasn't the case. There was no prisoner missing and there were no outstanding warrants for his arrest. Then again, that was quite hard to tell. No one knew who the hell he was. He wasn't communicating, so they decided to call him John River. River instead of Doe, because of where they found him. John River was a tall man, supposedly late 20s, early 30s. Prison and gang tattoos suggested he was connected to a criminal network in Chicago. That led us nowhere. For all intents and purposes, he was a complete mystery. That's where I was brought in. I am a licensed clinical social worker, or LCSW. I mostly handle case assessments and documentation for upcoming placements, but it's a system that's been struggling for years. I could go on and on about the effects of the opioid epidemic and the sudden rise of youth homelessness, but that is sadly part of the accepted world. We expect to see homeless people and substance abuse. We don't expect someone like John River. Since John wasn't deemed an immediate threat, I was brought in to make an assessment on whether it was appropriate to house him at a crisis stabilization center while we figured out his identity. It was supposed to be a short, informal meeting. They'd already made up their minds about him. I met John an early Tuesday morning in late May. He was still wearing his dirty prison jumpsuit when I sat down across from him. He'd just been out of the river for a couple of hours. We were at a holding cell at the county jail, a temporary measure. As you might suspect, we don't have a lot of resources set aside for this kind of event. I mean, how could we? We'd never met someone like John. He had a shaved head and this tired, empty smile, a blank stare like he forgot to blink. His jumpsuit was dirty all the way up to his knees, where the river had reached. He must have stood there for hours. Even with the jumpsuit, I could see the edges of his all-covering tattoos, lined with a couple of rough scars. The thought struck me that maybe they hadn't actually tried to talk to him like a person. Maybe they'd just interrogated him. I went at it from a different angle. "You look hungry," I said. "Are you hungry?" John's eyes slowly turned my way like an icebreaker making its way through a glacier. "I bet you're hungry," I repeated. "I could get you something if you want." He hissed a little. At first I thought it was a threat, but it turned into an unpleasant, raspy cough. He was trying to talk, but his voice was broken, like he'd been screaming at the top of his lungs. "Just tell me what you'd like. How about a cheeseburger?" He blinked, turned his head sideways, and nodded a little. His arm went up, like he was writing something in the air with the tip of his fingers. Then he frowned a little. "Am I hungry?" he asked. "Am I?" His voice came through like a broken speaker. "I think you are," I said. "You look hungry." Sometimes when people are in shock, you gotta be patient. John was responding at all. That was a step in the right direction. After much deliberation, he nodded again, and with that, his tired smile returned. "Yes," he said, "I am hungry." Little by little, we got him to speak, but there wasn't much for him to say. He had no idea who he was or how he got there. He said there were little flashes of something else, but he couldn't explain exactly what it was. We brought him a burger and some fries, and in between bites he would try and explain to the best of his ability. "It's not a place, not a person, not a home. I don't know. If you look at it long enough, you can see there's nothing inside." "Inside what?" I asked. He wiped his mouth and shook his head. I don't know what I'm saying." "And you have no idea who you are, or how you got here?" "I know one thing," he said, holding up a French fry. "I'm hungry." That's a start. I made an assessment that John wasn't a threat, and that it was okay to send him to one of our crisis stabilization centers for now. However, there was an issue on the matter of jurisdiction. See, the woman who'd found John had hurried home before calling the authorities, and she lived in another county than where he was originally found. So both sides had an argument for the other to take him in. Was it a matter of where he was found, or who brought him in? While they figured out the paperwork, he was deemed fit for temporary placement at our primary care facility. For those who've never been there, let me paint you a picture. A single-story building with greasy windows, gray and flat carpet squares, and a low, padded ceiling. 2 bathrooms, but only one works. The chairs by the reception area are bolted down, and they had to take away the TV. One staffer on call for about 12 hours of the day, with a guard dropping by for 30 minutes or so once per shift. There's a psychiatric nurse on rotation who comes by once a day, and we have a psychologist on call for remote assessment. That's mostly for extreme cases. There are 3 more facilities just like it, and I rotate from one to the other all day. I basically live in my car. To be fair, the beds are pretty nice. Sheets are washed regularly. John was lucky in a way. There was only one other person at the facility when he got there, a kid named Chris. Chris had just turned 18 and got kicked out of his house. He had an uncle on the West Coast that he was going to stay with, but there'd been a mix-up with the scheduling, and he ended up on the street. It was a temporary measure. Chris was just staying for a couple of days while he got his affairs in order. Helping people get back on their feet is a best-case scenario. Most of the time, we were treading water and seeing the same people over and over again. When John got there, he didn't seem all that bothered. He was happy to have his own room and didn't mind sharing a bathroom. He took a shower, got some secondhand clothes, and spent most of the afternoon reading comic books and snacking on roasted sunflower seeds, that salty brand with the blue logo. The on-site staffer, with the official title of behavioral health technician, was Sandy. She was a 40-year-old mother of 3 who'd heard every lie in the book. Sandy was naturally skeptic, but she didn't know what to make of John. She first thought he was an escaped convict, but there were no reports of anyone matching his description going missing. That stumped her. "I don't get the jumpsuit," she admitted. "Why come all the way out here and just stop? Why not keep going? Maybe he's got nowhere to go." We were having a 10-minute yogurt lunch before I rushed off to another meeting. Sandy usually joined me to catch up with the topics of the day. "You think he's hurt?" she asked. "Some kind of brain thing?" "Doesn't look like it. If he's been like this for a while, someone would be looking for him. And if it was fresh, he'd have wounds." "You saying he doesn't have anything? Nothing like that?" They cleared him at intake. There was a bit of tension when Chris joined in. He could be a bit difficult to get along with, but John was surprisingly patient. The 2 of them spent most of the day in the recreation room playing board games. John was a bit slow on the uptake, but that didn't seem to bother either of them. As long as there was ample supply of sandwiches, he paid attention. Chris could jabber on and on about whatever he wanted, ranging from the art of custom guitar pedals to the majesty of the St. Bernard dog breed. John just nodded along, ate his sandwich, and that was that. I spent the rest of the afternoon in phone calls as I made my rounds. They brought up the idea of bringing John in for a dental checkup. There might be dental records, but then we'd have to know where to start. We didn't have a hometown or even a home state. He didn't have a particular accent. And even if we had all that, someone had to pay for it. John wasn't insured. We didn't even know if he was a legal U.S. citizen. If we could find a supporting diagnosis of some kind, he might have been eligible for a long-term residential treatment facility, or possibly a state psychiatric hospital. He would need several sessions to get that kind of diagnosis, and we weren't equipped to keep him long-term. Most folks never stay more than a couple of days. Now we were looking at weeks, maybe months. The next day I woke up to 8 messages. One by one, our suggestions walked straight into bureaucratic walls. No one wanted to take on John as a responsibility, and there were no clear indications where to send him. That he was basically without an identity was bad enough, but that it wasn't clear what county he belonged to made it even worse. There were layers after layers of complications, ending with a lot of dead ends and polite refusals. But when I got there in the morning, it wasn't the bureaucratic limbo that bothered me, or Sandy. It was something we noticed in John's room. There was a big splotch on the wall, like someone had been tearing off the wallpaper. "You think he did that?" I asked. "Who else?" She got me there. I looked a little closer. The edges of the wallpaper were torn in strips, but there was nothing on the floor. He must have thrown it away or flushed it down the toilet. Maybe a stress reaction. Sandy, on the other hand, looked at the bed. "He hasn't slept," she said. "You sure?" "Yeah," she said, pointing to the covers. "I tuck them in like this, see? No one else does that. So either he slept in that chair or he didn't sleep at all." "What about the safety check?" "Mitch dropped in once around midnight, but I don't think he checked. Just noted no running, screaming, talking, nothing like that." John seemed all right. If he hadn't slept all night, it didn't show. He was up and about, letting Chris chat away as they headed off to the corner shop. That day was mostly spent doing evaluations. We got the on-call psychologist to come in and do an assessment, but he only had half an hour. His findings were inconclusive, as one might expect. John could be suffering from any number of conditions. There were a couple of things we could exclude, but you can't make a diagnosis based solely on negatives. We got another visit from the sheriff's office, but there wasn't much to share. John wasn't suspected of a crime, and there were no charges to press, so they would be letting go of the case entirely, at least until they could figure out which county he belonged to. I made my rounds to some of the other facilities. Nothing exciting and nothing I can say much about. You see these people who've slipped through the cracks in the system, and after a while that's all you see, cracks. You forget what it's like when things work as intended. I'll be the first to admit I was worried about what might happen to John. There was no telling where he might end up. While John was having dinner, I managed to sneak off with Chris for a while. I wanted to pick his brain about his new friend. "What's your impression?" I asked. "Has he told you anything?" "I mean, he's sort of just parroting," Chris said. "Like if I bring up how good a movie is, he agrees. It's like talking to a mirror." "Have you learned anything about him?" "Not really," Chris shrugged. "He seems to believe his name really is John River, and he really is hungry a lot. I've seen him peel the finish from the chairs and eat it." I raised an eyebrow at that. "The what?" "The wood finish," Chris repeated. "Check the chairs. There's like missing pieces. He just picks at it and eats." I checked the wooden chairs in the rec room, and just like he said, there were patches of missing finish where the wood had gone pale. That made it the second time John had been found eating things he shouldn't, and yet we saw him eating almost all of the time. He had a second portion for dinner and asked for a third. When he was denied, I almost saw a hint of emotion, I think. I made note of it, but it wasn't a big enough deal to get him in trouble. If anything, we were worried. It could be the sign of some kind of underlying trauma. A lot of folks who have been denied food for a long time tend to binge, and there had to be a reason why John was the way he was. Something must have happened. While most of the day was uneventful, I asked Sandy to keep an eye on him while I drove back and forth to the other facilities. I got a couple of updates. For example, he'd been found chewing the heads off chess pieces, and he might have drunk a little hand soap. Not the strangest thing I'd seen, but a clear sign that something was off. The next morning, I woke up to a text from Sandy. She asked me to come right away. When I got there, John was still in his room. Sandy was visibly shaken, and I could see something had changed in her body language. She seemed smaller somehow, like she'd crawled into herself. "I've already called Mitch," she said. "He got a spoon from the kitchen." "A spoon?" "It's..." She rolled her eyes a little, looking for the right words. "I don't know. See for yourself." John was sitting in his room, in a chair, facing away from the door. He was scraping drywall into his hand and licking up the dust, like a dog drinking from a bowl. He was taking it slow and steady, savoring the sensation. He didn't seem to care that we were looking at him. "John, what are you doing?" "I'm hungry," he said. "I eat." "You can't eat that, John. That's drywall. I'm hungry. He scraped a little more. I stepped forward, but Sandy put her hand on my shoulder. John's head snapped my way like I was a scavenger trying to poach his kill. There was something about his eyes that caught me off guard, something predatory. Sandy shook her head, muttering a no under her breath. John turned his attention back to the wall, scraping more and more into the palm of his hand. His tongue lapped it up, and the process started over and over and over again. His whole mouth had turned gray from the dust. By the time Mitch got there, John had eaten a hand-sized chunk of drywall. He wasn't even bothering with the spoon anymore. He'd broken pieces off and bit down like they were slices of succulent honeycomb. His eyes kind of glazed over. He didn't seem to react to the chemicals or the taste. It was all instinct to him. We had to get him to stop, but we'd have to use Mitch to do it. Now Mitch is a big guy, about 6'4", maybe 250 pounds. But I could tell he didn't want to do this. John was a thin, wiry guy. The gang tattoos didn't help. After mustering a bit of courage, he tapped the doorframe with a knock. "All right, time's up," Mitch said. "Let's get you to the kitchen, my man. We'll get you something tastier." John didn't answer. He just took another bite. He was barely chewing anymore. I could see the bulge in his throat as a solid chunk slid down his throat. Mitch took a couple steps forward, and John turned to look him in the eye. "Don't you want something good?" Mitch asked. "That's not food, my guy. I'm hungry." "I bet you're a lot of other things," Mitch said, trying on a smile. "I bet you're a bit worried, huh? A lot of stuff going on that's out of your control." "No," John said, shaking his head. "Hungry." Mitch sighed and offered a hand to help John out of the chair. John didn't take it. When Mitch stepped closer to pull him out, John lunged forward, snapping his teeth so loudly that I thought he'd clapped his hands. Mitch pulled his hand back and fell backwards, tripping over his own feet. He fell over hard, getting the air knocked out of his lungs. We backed away, pulling Mitch back up to his feet. John was slowly creeping out of his chair, crouching like a skulking animal. I could still see the drywall coating his mouth, turning it a sickly gray. He'd been biting so hard that his gums were bleeding and his teeth were worn down. Even without something to eat, he was still chewing, opening and closing his mouth like a fish out of water. I could hear his stomach growling. "John?" Sandy whispered. "John, what's happening?" "I'm hungry." Sandy called the police while Mitch and I tried to keep him calm. John ended up on the rec room couch, stripping the cheap leather off and rolling it into balls. We figured it wasn't worth fighting him over it. Most of the furniture was cheap donor stuff, but we didn't want him to get sick. But from the looks of it, it was too late. By the time the cops came by, he'd swallowed about half a couch cushion and part of the armrest. Chris was just standing in the corner, watching the whole thing play out. He was leaving to see his uncle later that night, so he wasn't about to get involved anytime soon. Mitch and I figured it was better to let the cops deal with this. When a patrol finally showed up, Sandy and I tried to explain the situation. We didn't have to say much. They'd heard about the mysterious river stranger already. The part about eating furniture was new, though. "You want him trespassed?" one of them asked. "We can't keep him," I explained, "and he refuses to stop, so we'll take him then. Or do you just want us to ask him to stop?" "He's not gonna stop," Sandy added. "He said it, he's hungry. Everyone gets full eventually." I wasn't so sure about that. They went into the rec room, where John had gotten up from the couch. He was folding up playing cards and swallowing them whole. The two officers took a moment to stare at him. Now I'll give them credit. They tried talking him down, but John wasn't having it. The moment they got close, he faced them. It was going to be a fight, no doubt about it. He couldn't be reasoned with. They flanked him from each side. As one of them drew his attention, the other advanced with the handcuffs. They managed to wrestle him to the floor and put his hands behind his back, knocking over a table lamp and a chair as they slammed him down. John was like a rabid animal, not angry over being handled, but over his inability to use his hands to feed. One of the officers paused for a moment when they spotted blood on the floor. Maybe he thought they'd been too rough. Sandy just shook her head. "It's his gums," she clarified. "It's not you." They pulled him up and dragged him out the front door, but the moment they got him outside, something changed. John snapped his head straight backwards like a whip. It was hard and fast enough to snap a normal person's neck. He clasped his teeth shut, biting down on the shoulder of the arresting officer's jacket. Surprised, he pulled away, letting John go. John flapped backwards, landing hard on the concrete. He still munched on a piece of fabric, but there were also a couple of drops of blood. The officer was holding his shoulder, looking like he'd seen a ghost. It wasn't a deep wound, but seeing someone almost break their neck like that, it wasn't natural. I'd never seen anyone move like that. We all just stood there looking at John as he calmly rolled onto his stomach and got up on his knees. The other officer had his gun out. Chris was filming the whole thing from the window. By the time John got to his feet, they had asked him to stop moving at least 4 times. Backup was on the way. Finally, he stopped. "I need you to turn around," one of the officers said. "Turn around and get on your knees." John smacked his lips. He still had a little bit of fabric at corner of his mouth. There was blood on it. He slurped it up, and I could see his pupils dilate. The officer kept talking in a neutral tone. "Go right ahead and turn around. We have to bring you in." "I'm hungry," John stated. "Turn around, I'm not asking again." And it's like I saw something click in John's mind, like a light turned on. His eyes narrowed. "Your food," he gasped. "I can eat you." Now I know these 2 officers. They weren't the kind of people to shoot first and ask questions later. They'd been as clear as they could be. Sandy couldn't look, but couldn't look away either. She hid her face behind her hands, hoping nothing would happen. But it did. John took 2 steps forward, got a warning, and kept walking. A shot went off. Now I doubt what I saw, but I'm sure I saw it. I jumped as my pulse kicked. As soon as that shot rang out, there was a puff of smoke. Not from the gun, but from John. It's like they'd shot straight into a wall. I could see a hole in his clothes, but he was still standing. He wasn't even looking down. His eyes were fixed on the officer he'd bit. John didn't react, not at all. "Your food," he repeated, like he couldn't believe it. "I can eat you." He pulled at his handcuffs until something in his left hand snapped, setting him free. The cuffs dangled from his right hand as he took another step forwards, a couple of fingers bent at a weird angle. I covered my ears and closed my eyes as another 3 shots rang out. When I looked up, one of the officers was in full sprint with John a couple of steps behind him. They all disappeared around the corner as Sandy locked the door, backing away from the windows. No one said anything. We just looked at one another, trying to figure out what the fuck just happened. There was more gunfire outside and screaming, a lot of screaming. My hands shook as I heard John's words in my head. We were food. He could eat us. 3 more patrol cars arrived shortly after. One of them escorted us out of the building. The others went ahead to find whatever happened to the other officers. More people were coming. We could hear sirens in the distance. Sandy headed off to get Chris to the train station while I headed off. I think she just wanted some distance. I had other facilities to check on my daily round, and doing some honest-to-God work might help me keep my mind off of things for a while. Besides, there was no telling what might happen if I stayed. I kept getting updates. It didn't take long until they found the officers. They had to be brought out by ambulance, but that's all the details I got. They were alive, but something had clearly happened. Mitch said it looked bad. They'd lost track of John. There'd been a struggle, and someone had gotten seriously hurt. They were talking immediate surgery, but they didn't bring him in, so we weren't safe to go back. There was little we could do but to wait. For a while, I went on like normal. I checked the other facilities. I got an update on Chris and how he'd made it to his uncle. He sent me the video he took of John, but I couldn't bring myself to look. After a couple of days, Sandy got back to her job. They had to bring in a new guy to the center, so she didn't have much choice but to get it up and running. At least, this was a person with issues we recognized and who had an ID. I kept hearing disturbing things. People who swore they'd seen someone skulking around town. Some folks by the river swore they'd found a pile of half-eaten fish along the trail. A couple of business owners around town had their trash cans raided. I mean, things like this happen all the time, but I couldn't help but to wonder, you know? And then there were more unsettling implications. There had been a break-in at the graveyard. Someone had disturbed a freshly dug grave. That's all they told us. Personally, I only saw one thing. I drive by the same field every morning when I go to work, and I spotted something. Right by the fence, there was a dead cow. The other cows had gathered around it, mooing like a funeral procession. The dead cow was open wide, seemingly torn open by something sharp. Again, maybe nothing, but it kept reminding me of him. John could be hungry enough to eat a cow. About a month passed. Even absurd things can look menial in the rearview mirror, I suppose. That is, until they come knocking on your door. It wasn't so much a knock, though. I was coming home from work. I have a small townhouse on the outskirts of the city, 2nd floor. Nice place, not too big. I dragged myself up the stairs, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. I pushed the door shut behind me and kicked off my shoes, but then I stopped. I hadn't heard the click. You know, from the door closing. In fact, it bounced back open again, the door handle poking me in the back. Turning around, I saw a hand in the doorway. Now, the shock of seeing something like that so close to me, so suddenly, could stop a heart. I swung around and backed into my apartment, gasping. A long arm stretched inside, reaching for the light switch. It flicked off. I took out my phone, put my thumb to the lock, and turned on the flashlight. It was turned down, and for a brief moment, I saw a pair of second-hand jeans standing in front of me, with a pair of gray feet at the end. There was something wrong with them, but I only caught a brief glimpse. They looked softer, flabby. A cold hand closed over mine, blocking the flashlight. The feet disappeared into darkness with the rest of the room. A wet mouth hushed me, sending rough spatters across my cheek. "You got anything good?" a voice asked. I could hear the hiss of a moist tongue, the slurp of someone salivating. "Let's check," it continued. "Show me the kitchen." With a hand grasping me, I walked towards the kitchen. I held my breath. It only took a couple seconds, but I could hear every detail with superhuman clarity. The heavy smack of bare footsteps. The voice was coming from higher up, almost reaching the ceiling. There was also something else. There was this constant smacking and chewing noise even while it talked. Like there was more than one mouth. It had to be John, but it sounded nothing like him. There was also this long, constant groan, like a stomach that could never settle. I made it to the kitchen. The hand reached up to my neck. Not forcefully, but enough to show that I wasn't in control. The fingers were impossibly long and leathery, more belt than skin. I was turned around, but I saw the lights from the fridge. A shadow was cast on the kitchen wall. I could barely make out the shape. There were too many arms. Glass shattered against the kitchen counter. It found my pickle jar. With a slurp and crunch, it spoke. "Why'd you say I was hungry?" it asked. That made me pause. I could feel my pulse pushing against the leathery hand on my throat. "What?" It was the only word I could muster. "You said I looked like hunger." "No, I said you looked hungry." "What do you mean?" Another crunch, this time glass. It didn't skip a beat. How the hell could it eat and talk at the same time? "I just thought you were hungry. I was making conversation," I said. "I wasn't identifying you. Everyone gets hungry." "You do?" There was a short pause. More crunching. Something warm dripped on my shoulder. Something smelling of fat and iron. "You asked me," it continued. "You asked if I was hunger. You made me choose." "That's not how it works," I said, swallowing hard. "That's just how you say it." "Doesn't matter." The fridge door opened again. I saw a glob of something gray and bleeding on my shoulder, slowly dripping onto the kitchen floor. The door closed. I could hear the squeeze of a ketchup bottle. "I'm not going to eat you." I didn't say anything. I tried to keep my breath steady. I'm hungry, I'll be hungry tomorrow too, and the day after that, there's no rush. I took a shallow breath, straining my eyes to look to the side. I couldn't see anything. Something moved, maybe a shrug. It was mumbling, talking to itself. Everything gets eaten. There was a tap on my shoulder as something dragged itself away and let me go. The ketchup bottle was squeezed dry. I could hear it getting crushed and chewed. I stayed there by the fridge, listening to something immense move away from me. I could have reached for my phone, maybe I could have taken a picture, but I wouldn't have moved for anything. I wanted to know, it said. It's almost funny. Sure, I said, my mouth dry. Funny. It's all right, it said with a sigh. Being hungry is better than being nothing. What do you mean? There was a pause. It felt so unreal. I could hear cars passing on the street outside. How can something so mundane be allowed to happen at a time like that? You'll see, it answered. Later. I heard the click of the door. It was quiet, but to me, it was like a starting pistol. I flicked the lights on. The apartment was full of bloody drag marks and chunks of gray, dead flesh. Pieces of glass were scattered over the floor and kitchen counter. Brine was still dripping. There was nothing left of the ketchup bottle. John had left my pork chops behind. He had literally just grabbed whatever was closest on the shelf, not caring what it was. It was such a stupid thought, but it bothered me. Why would he chug a bottle of ketchup over biting into a meal? Maybe hunger means different things from one person to the next. I haven't heard anyone experiencing something similar. No one has talked about John River or the way he changed. I don't think we ever figured out who he really was. Looking back at it, I'm having a hard time remembering what his face really looked like. It's like thinking of a concept, not a person. Not a real person, at least. I've attributed a couple of things I'm certain of when writing this down, but looking back at it, I'll be honest, I'm not sure. I don't know what could have happened for him to become something like this. But exactly what? Well, I'm not sure I want to know. I'm not going to go looking. I don't want to hear that soft gray mouth ever again, but I think I will.